faithful until forever. The bond that death cannot break. The silence hung like fog in the memorial chapel, broken only by the soft rustling of dress uniforms and the nearly imperceptible sound of tears being held back. Atlas, a German shepherd with eyes that had witnessed both humanity's courage and cruelty, stood rigid at the entrance, his leash taut in Lieutenant Hayes' grip. His nose twitched, cataloging scents: polished wood, lilies, the distinct cologne Mason always wore. But one smell overwhelmed them all: grief. It saturated the air, invisible yet more tangible than the morning light filtering through stained glass. Atlas's ears suddenly pricked forward, his muscles tensed. He had detected something no one else in the room could perceive. Without warning, the shepherd lunged forward with such force that the leash slipped from Hayes' fingers. Gasps rippled through the congregation as Atlas bolted down the center aisle, his nails clicking against marble in a desperate rhythm. Before anyone could intercept him, he leaped, a fluid, powerful arc, landing directly inside the flag-draped casket, where Staff Sergeant Mason Reynolds lay in eternal rest. For one breathtaking moment, as Atlas settled his body against his handler's chest, it almost seemed as if Mason might open his eyes. But this wasn't the beginning of a miracle. It was the start of a goodbye that would change everyone who witnessed it. The weight of silence pressed down on everyone in the chapel, making each breath feel like a deliberate act. Atlas had positioned himself across Mason's chest, his head resting in the hollow of his handler's neck, a position as familiar to both of them as breathing. The German shepherd's body trembled slightly, a continuous shiver that seemed to reverberate through the entire room. Claire Reynolds clutched the edge of the wooden pew, her knuckles white with tension. Her brother's funeral was supposed to follow protocol, clean, orderly, dignified. But now all eyes were fixed on the dog who refused to be separated from his fallen partner. Her carefully pinned hair had begun to come loose, several strands falling across her tear-streaked face, but she made no move to fix it. What did appearances matter now? "Nobody move," Chaplain Mitchell whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let him be." Lieutenant Hayes stood frozen at the end of the aisle, the empty leash still dangling from his fingers. He had served with Mason and Atlas for 3 tours, had seen the inseparable bond between handler and nine forged in the crucible of combat, yet even he seemed unprepared for this raw display of devotion. "He doesn't understand," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. "He thinks Mason is just sleeping." Several rows back, a younger soldier, Private Cooper, pressed his fist against his mouth, failing to suppress a sob. The sound broke through the silence, causing a ripple effect as others in uniform shifted uncomfortably, their composure threatening to crumble. Atlas remained oblivious to the human emotion surrounding him. His entire world had narrowed to the still form beneath him. He nudged Mason's chin with his nose, a gesture he had performed countless times in the field when it was time to move out. His tail remained still, his breathing shallow and quick. Lieutenant Hayes finally stepped forward, approaching the casket with measured steps. "Atlas," he called softly. "Come here, boy." The dog's ears twitched at the familiar voice, but he made no move to obey. In the field, Atlas had been flawless, responding to commands with immediate precision. But here in this chapel, those rules no longer seemed to apply. Something more primal, more fundamental had taken precedence over his training. Claire wiped her eyes and stood on unsteady legs. "Let me try," she said, moving toward the casket. The congregation watched in silence as she approached and placed a gentle hand on Atlas's back. "Hey," she whispered, her voice trembling but warm. "I know. I miss him too." Atlas turned his head slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting hers. Claire had always thought Mason exaggerated when he said his dog could understand human emotions, but the pain she saw reflected in those eyes made her catch her breath. This wasn't just animal instinct. This was grief, complex and devastating. "He loved you so much," she continued, stroking the shepherd's fur. "He told me all about you in his letters. How you found those children in the collapsed building. How you stayed with him during that sandstorm." Atlas whined softly, a sound so full of sorrow it pierced the hearts of everyone present. His body remained pressed against Mason, but his eyes stayed fixed on Claire, as if searching for answers she couldn't give. The chaplain cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the service that needed to continue. "Perhaps," he suggested gently, "Atlas should be part of this. He has earned that right." Lieutenant Hayes nodded. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted quietly. "In all my years working with military dogs, they sense death. They understand loss. But this," he gestured helplessly at the tableau before them, "this is something else." Atlas suddenly stiffened, his entire body going rigid. His ears stood at full attention, his gaze shifting from Claire to a point just beyond the casket. The change was so dramatic that several people turned to see what had captured his attention. There was nothing there, just empty air and shifting dust motes in the slanted morning light. But Atlas was tracking something, his head moving slightly as if following an invisible presence. A chill rippled through the chapel. "What is it, boy?" Claire whispered, her skin prickling with goosebumps. "What do you see?" The German shepherd's tail moved, just once, a small wag that was there and gone in an instant. His posture remained alert, focused, as if receiving information no human could detect. Lieutenant Hayes exchanged a glance with the chaplain, neither man willing to voice what many were thinking. Even the most hardened soldiers in the room felt a collective shiver. Atlas continued to stare, unblinking, at the empty space. Then, gradually, his rigid posture began to soften. His breathing deepened. The trembling that had coursed through his body since he'd entered the chapel slowly subsided. Claire watched in confusion, her hand still resting on his back. "Atlas?" she questioned softly. The dog finally lowered his gaze, looking once more at Mason's face. He leaned down and gently licked his handler's cheek. A single farewell gesture, before turning his attention back to Claire. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. Something had shifted, as if a message had been received, a permission granted. The chaplain's voice, when he finally spoke, seemed to come from far away. "Dogs perceive what we cannot," he said, his words hanging in the still air. "Perhaps that is why we call them faithful." No one disagreed. No one spoke at all. The mystery of what Atlas had sensed remained unspoken, but its effect was undeniable. The atmosphere in the chapel had transformed. Grief remained, heavy and real, but now something else lingered alongside it. Something that felt almost like peace. The chapel remained suspended in that strange liminal moment, not quite acceptance, not fully grief. Atlas had settled beside Mason, no longer frantically trying to wake him, but maintaining his vigil with quiet dignity. His breathing had steadied, though his eyes occasionally flicked toward that same empty space that had captured his attention earlier. Claire sat on the front pew, her brother's service medals clutched in trembling hands. Each medal told a story of courage, of sacrifice, of a life dedicated to protecting others. She ran her thumb over the bronze star, remembering the phone call when Mason had downplayed the heroism that earned it. "Atlas did all the work," he had insisted. "I just followed." Lieutenant Hayes approached and knelt beside her, his voice low. The thought of moving forward, of continuing the ceremony that would ultimately separate her from her brother forever, made her chest constrict painfully. From his position beside the casket, Atlas watched the exchange, his ears shifting forward at the mention of the honor guard. Despite his grief, Years of training kept him attuned to military procedures and terminology. His tail remained still, but his posture subtly straightened. "He understands more than we think," Lieutenant Hayes observed, noticing the change in Atlas. "Mason always said they could have entire conversations without a single word." Claire managed a fragile smile. "Mason talked about him constantly. Sometimes I think he sent more photos of Atlas than of himself." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on her since the notification officers had appeared at her door. "What happens to him now?" Hayes looked at Atlas, his expression solemn. Normally, military working dogs who lose their handlers are reassigned or adopted. But Atlas, he trailed off, searching for the right words. Atlas is different. His bond with Mason was exceptional. "You think he won't accept another handler?" Claire asked. "I don't know," Hayes admitted. "But I've never seen a dog grieve like this." Across the chapel, Private Cooper approached the casket hesitantly. Unlike the other soldiers present, Cooper was new to the unit, had never served alongside Mason and Atlas. But as the youngest member of their company, he had heard the stories of the legendary 9 team that could detect IDs no technology could find, of the night they had tracked a missing child through a sandstorm, of the countless lives they had saved. Atlas watched the young soldier approach, his head tilting slightly in assessment. After a moment of consideration, he allowed Cooper to place a respectful hand on his back. "I never met your handler," Cooper whispered to the dog, "but everyone says he was the best of us." Atlas blinked slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the stained glass light. The gesture was almost acknowledgement, a silent thank you for the recognition of Mason's worth. The chaplain, who had been conferring with the honor guard near the entrance, returned to the front of the chapel. "If we're ready," he said gently, "we should proceed." Claire took a deep breath and stood. This was the moment she had been dreading. The final march, the folded flag, the rifle salute, the irrevocable confirmation that her brother was truly gone. "Atlas," Hayes called softly. "Come." For a moment, it seemed the German shepherd might refuse, might continue his vigil regardless of protocol or command. But after a brief hesitation, he rose to his feet. His movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. As he stepped back from the casket, he paused, looking down at Mason one last time, then moved to sit beside Claire. The honor guard advanced with measured steps, their movements synchronized by years of practice and tradition. As they positioned themselves beside the casket, Atlas watched with unwavering attention. His ears were erect, his posture impeccable, a soldier attending to duty despite personal pain. With precise movements, the honor guard lifted the American flag from the casket, holding it taut between them as they began the solemn folding ritual. Each triangle was created with exacting care, transforming the sprawling stars and stripes into a compact, symbolic triangle. Claire felt Atlas press against her leg as the flag grew smaller with each fold. Whether he was offering comfort or seeking it, she couldn't tell, but she was grateful for his warm, solid presence. When the flag was finally presented to her, the weight of it in her hands made her breath catch. This was real. This was happening. Her brother wasn't coming home. Atlas watched the exchange intently, his gaze following the flag as it passed from the honor guard to Claire's trembling hands. Something about the ritual seemed to resonate with him, to align with his understanding of honor and sacrifice. Then came the moment that shattered what composure remained in the chapel. As the pallbearers moved to lift the casket, Atlas let out a sound, not quite a bark, not fully a whimper, but something in between. A protest, a plea, a recognition that this was the final separation. Claire knelt beside him, one arm still cradling the folded flag, the other wrapping around the shepherd's powerful neck. "It's okay," she whispered, though her tears belied her words. "It's okay." Atlas trembled against her, but he didn't move to stop the procession. Instead, as the casket was lifted and the slow march began, he fell into step beside Claire. His training asserted itself in this critical moment. Head high, pace measured, matching the cadence of the honor guard. Together, dog and sister followed Mason on his final journey, neither one able to say goodbye, both somehow understanding that some bonds transcend even death's finality. The procession emerged from the chapel into the harsh clarity of midday sun. The transition was jarring, from the muted reverent stillness inside to the vast blue sky and distant sounds of life continuing beyond the cemetery gates. Atlas blinked against the brightness, his steps momentarily faltering as they left the building's shadow. Claire kept her hand on his back, steadying herself as much as offering him reassurance. The folded flag pressed against her chest felt both impossibly heavy and strangely insubstantial. This fabric triangle, the official acknowledgment of her brother's sacrifice, seemed too small to contain the magnitude of who Mason had been. Lieutenant Hayes walked on her other side, his presence a silent support. Behind them followed Mason's unit, each soldier maintaining the precise, measured pace of the funeral march. Their boot heels struck the pavement in perfect unison, creating a rhythm that served as both tribute and lament. At the gravesite, chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing the open earth. Atlas hesitated at the sight, his nose lifting as he scented the freshly turned soil. Claire felt him press closer to her side, his body conveying what he couldn't express in words: the wrongness of placing Mason in the ground, the instinctive resistance to this final separation. "Come on, boy," she whispered, guiding him forward. They took their places in the front row as the pallbearers positioned the casket above the grave. Atlas sat at attention beside Claire's chair, his eyes never leaving the polished wood that contained his handler. Despite his evident distress, he maintained the dignified bearing that had made him exceptional in the field. Mason had often joked that Atlas had better military posture than most of the human soldiers. The memory brought a fleeting smile to Claire's lips, quickly replaced by a fresh wave of grief. There would be no more stories, no more late-night phone calls, where Mason recounted Atlas's latest accomplishment with unmistakable pride. Chaplain Mitchell stepped forward, his Bible open in his weathered hands. "We commit Staff Sergeant Mason Reynolds to the earth," he began, his voice carrying across the cemetery. "A soldier who lived with courage, served with honor, and loved with his whole heart." Atlas's ears swiveled toward the chaplain, tracking his words. Though he couldn't understand their meaning, he recognized their solemnity. "Mason once told me," the chaplain continued, "that he had never known loyalty like he found in his 9 partner. He said Atlas taught him what it meant to trust completely, to communicate without words, to find joy in service." He paused, looking directly at the German shepherd. "Perhaps these are lessons for all of us." Claire clutched the flag tighter, tears streaming freely now. Beside her, she felt Atlas shift, his attention suddenly diverted from the casket. Following his gaze, she saw nothing, just empty air beside the grave. Yet Atlas was completely focused, his head tilted in that distinctive way that indicated he was listening intently. Lieutenant Hayes noticed, too. He leaned closer to Claire, his voice barely audible. "What is he?" Before he could finish the question, Atlas stood. Every human eye turned to the shepherd as he stepped forward with deliberate purpose. There was no frantic energy now, no desperate rush as there had been in the chapel. Instead, his movements were measured, almost ceremonial, as he approached the casket one final time. Claire started to rise to call him back, but Hayes gently touched her arm. "Wait," he murmured, "just watch." Atlas reached the casket and sat beside it, his posture military perfect. For a long moment he remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Then, with slow precision, he raised his right paw and placed it on the polished wood. The gesture, so intentional, so human in its meaning, drew a collective intake of breath from the gathered mourners. It wasn't just a dog's reaction to loss. It was a deliberate farewell, a final salute from one soldier to another. Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, unable to contain a sob. Around her, even the most disciplined soldiers fought to maintain their composure. What they were witnessing transcended training, transcended even the bond between handler and working dog. This was something elemental, a connection that defied easy categorization. Atlas held the position for several heartbeats, then slowly lowered his paw. He remained beside the casket, his eyes still tracking something invisible. Then, unexpectedly, his tail moved, not the full, joyous wag from happier days, but a subtle acknowledgement, a recognition. A breeze stirred the air, ruffling the shepherd's fur, and carrying with it the scent of coming rain. Atlas lifted his head, testing this new information, then turned to look directly at Claire. The change in him was subtle but unmistakable. A shift from desperate grief to something closer to acceptance. He returned to her side, pressing against her legs as the rifle squad positioned themselves for the salute. When the first shot cracked the air, Atlas didn't flinch. He stood steady through all 21 reports, his training holding even in this moment of profound emotion. As the last echoes faded, a lone bugler raised his instrument. The first pure note of taps floated across the cemetery, haunting in its simplicity. Atlas's ears pivoted toward the sound, his head lifting as the melody unfolded. Claire watched him through tear-blurred vision, struck by the thought that this military tribute meant as much to Atlas as to any human present. He had lived the soldier's life alongside Mason, had faced the same dangers, endured the same hardships, celebrated the same victories. This music was as much for him as for any of them. When the final note faded into silence, the honor guard began the solemn task of lowering the casket. Atlas watched intently, his body tense but controlled. Claire rested her hand on his back, feeling his rapid heartbeat gradually slow as the casket disappeared from view. "Goodbye," she whispered. The word meant for her brother, but perhaps also for the life she had known before grief, changed everything. Atlas turned to look at her, then back at the grave, then once more at that empty space that had repeatedly captured his attention. Whatever he perceived there, whatever presence or absence or memory, it seemed to provide him something no human comfort could offer. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Atlas exhaled deeply, a sound so profoundly human in its resignation that several people glanced at him in surprise. He remained at Claire's side as the ceremony concluded, as condolences were offered, as the crowd gradually dispersed. Only when they were nearly alone did he allow his military bearing to soften. He leaned against Claire's leg, no longer the perfect working dog, but simply an animal missing his person. "I know," she told him, kneeling to embrace him despite the now steady rain. "I know." And somehow, in that moment of shared grief, a new bond began to form, different from what either had lost, but genuine nonetheless. Two beings connected by their love for the same man, by the empty space he had left in their lives, and by the long road of healing that stretched before them. Rain fell in earnest as the cemetery emptied, turning the packed earth around Mason's grave into a dark mirror that reflected the gray sky above. Most of the mourners had retreated to their vehicles, heading toward the community center where a reception would offer the comfort of shared memories and warm food. But Claire couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. She stood beneath a hastily opened umbrella that Lieutenant Hayes had pressed into her hands, the folded flag now protected inside her coat. Atlas remained by her side, indifferent to the water soaking his coat. His attention stayed fixed on the grave, watching as cemetery workers began the final process of filling in the earth. Each shovelful of soil that fell made a soft, final sound that seemed to echo the permanence of what they had lost. "You don't have to stay," Claire told Hayes, who had lingered with them despite the worsening weather. "I know everyone's waiting." The lieutenant shook his head. "Mason would never forgive me if I left you two out here alone," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Besides, I'm not ready either." They stood in silence as the rain drummed against the umbrella and ran in rivulets through Atlas's fur. The shepherd had not whined or barked since they'd left the chapel. His grief had settled into something quieter, more dignified, but no less profound. When the workers finished their task, nodding respectfully to the small group before departing, Hayes finally spoke again. "Claire, about Atlas," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I need to tell you what happens next." She tightened her hand in the shepherd's fur. This was the conversation she had been dreading, the question of what would become of her brother's beloved partner, now that their unit had been permanently separated. "The standard protocol would be to evaluate him for reassignment," Hayes explained. "He's still young, still capable of service." Atlas turned his head at the lieutenant's words, as if understanding they were discussing his future. His dark eyes moved between the two humans, alert and assessing. "But," Claire prompted, hearing the hesitation in Hayes' voice, "but I've never seen a military working dog react like this." He gestured toward the grave. "The bond he shared with Mason was exceptional. Trying to pair him with another handler might not be fair to him," Claire finished. Hayes nodded. "There's another option. Military dogs can sometimes be adopted by handlers' families. It's not automatic. There's an application process, home evaluations. But given the circumstances," Claire looked down at Atlas, studying his intelligent face, the touches of gray beginning to show around his muzzle. He had already given so much in service. The thought of him being forced to start over with a new handler, possibly returning to combat zones without Mason, made her heart ache. "I don't know anything about caring for a working dog," she admitted. "Mason was the one who understood all of that. He's been trained to adapt," Hayes said quietly. "And you already have the most important qualification." "What's that?" "You loved Mason." His voice softened. "That matters to Atlas more than you might think." As if to confirm this assessment, Atlas pressed closer to Claire's side, his warm weight steady against her leg. There was something in the gesture that felt like choice, like the shepherd, faced with an uncertain future, was declaring his preference. Claire knelt despite the muddy ground, bringing herself eye level with Atlas. Rain spattered against her face, mingling with fresh tears. "Would you want to come home with me?" she asked him directly. "It wouldn't be the same, I know that. I can't be what Mason was to you. But we could figure it out together." Atlas studied her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see far more than an animal should. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he leaned forward and pressed his nose against her cheek. Not quite a kiss, more an acknowledgement, a promise perhaps. "I think that's a yes," Hayes said, the ghost of a smile touching his lips for the first time that day. Claire wrapped her arms around Atlas's neck, burying her face in his wet fur. He smelled of rain and earth and something indefinably reassuring. A living connection to her brother that she hadn't dared hope for. "I'll help with the paperwork," Hayes offered, "and anything else you need. Training refreshers, equipment, whatever makes the transition easier." "Thank you," Claire whispered, standing again. She took one last look at the grave, at the temporary marker that would soon be replaced by a permanent stone. "I think we're ready now." As they turned to leave, Atlas paused. He looked back over his shoulder, ears alert, head tilted, in that particular way Claire had come to recognize. He was listening again, attending to something only he could perceive. Instead of calling him forward, Claire waited, allowing him this moment. Whatever connection Atlas maintained with Mason, whether memory, scent, or something beyond human understanding, she wouldn't interfere with it. After several seconds, Atlas turned back to her. His posture relaxed, his steps lighter as he came to her side. Together, they walked toward the cemetery gates, leaving footprints that the rain would soon wash away. But some marks Claire knew would never disappear. The impact Mason had made on the world, the lives he and Atlas had saved, the love that had bound them together. These things remained, indelible, carried forward in memory, and in the remarkable animal who now walked beside her. As they reached the parking lot, the rain began to ease. A weak shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating puddles and wet gravestones. It wasn't an ending, Claire realized. It was just the beginning of a different path. "Come on, Atlas," she said, opening the car door. "Let's go home." 2 months after the funeral, Claire sat on her back porch, watching as Atlas investigated the perimeter of the fenced yard. His movements were methodical, purposeful. The same route he took each morning and evening, maintaining a vigilance that had been ingrained through years of training. She sipped her coffee, tracking the shepherd's progress with a smile that came more easily these days. The first weeks had been difficult for both of them. Atlas had been restless at night, pacing the hallways, checking windows and doors. Claire had found him more than once, lying beside the empty guest bedroom where Mason had stayed during his last leave, as if waiting for his handler to emerge. For her part, Claire had struggled to understand Atlas's needs, the specific commands he knew, the routines that provided him security, the signs that indicated his changing moods. Lieutenant Hayes had been an invaluable resource, visiting weekly to help with the transition and translate the unique language that had developed between dog and handler. "He's looking for purpose," Hayes had explained during one particularly challenging day when Atlas had refused to settle. "His entire life has been structured around missions, around protecting Mason. He needs to feel useful." Taking that advice to heart, Claire had enrolled them in a therapy dog training program. Atlas, with his impeccable obedience and intuitive sensitivity to human emotions, had excelled. Now, twice a week they visited the local VA hospital, where Atlas provided comfort to veterans facing their own battles. It wasn't the same as detecting explosives or tracking missing persons, but it was meaningful work. Claire had watched the transformation in Atlas as he found this new way to serve. This new mission that honored Mason's memory while creating something positive from their shared loss. Atlas completed his inspection of the yard and trotted back to the porch, his movement fluid despite the slight arthritis that Hayes had warned would eventually affect his joints. He climbed the steps and settled beside Claire's chair with a contented sigh. "Good job, Sentinel," she told him, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "All secure?" Atlas leaned into her touch, his dark eyes meeting hers with what she had come to recognize as affection. The bond between them had grown steadily, different from what he had shared with Mason, but genuine in its own right. They had built their relationship on mutual grief, yes, but also on respect, on patience, on the gradual discovery of each other's strengths and vulnerabilities. Claire's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen to see a reminder from Hayes about the memorial service planned for the 1-year anniversary of Mason's deployment. Several members of his unit would be attending, along with families of other fallen soldiers. "We should go," she told Atlas, who tilted his head at her shift in tone. "It would be good to see everyone." The shepherd watched her face carefully, attuned to the subtle emotional changes that often accompanied mentions of Mason or the military. In the early days, such references had triggered visible distress in both of them. Now, there was melancholy but also a measure of peace. Claire's gaze drifted to the shadow box mounted on the living room wall, visible through the porch door. It contained Mason's medals, his unit patch, and a photograph of him kneeling beside a younger Atlas in desert camouflage gear. Both were looking at the camera with identical expressions of alert readiness. Sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Claire found herself talking to Mason as if he might somehow hear her. She told him about Atlas's progress, about the veterans whose faces brightened when the shepherd entered their hospital rooms, about the nights when grief still caught her by surprise. "You'd be proud of him," she said softly, knowing Atlas was listening even if her brother couldn't be. "He is still the best of the best." At the sound of his title, "Best of the Best" had been Mason's favorite phrase for his 9 partner. Atlas's ears perked up. His tail swept once against the porch boards, a gesture of acknowledgement. A breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging from the eave, creating a gentle melody that blended with distant bird song. Atlas suddenly lifted his head, his attention captured by something in the yard. Claire followed his gaze but saw nothing, just sunlight and shadow playing across the grass. She had grown accustomed to these moments when Atlas seemed to perceive things beyond human detection. Sometimes it was simply his superior senses, picking up sounds or scents she couldn't register. But other times, like now, there was a quality to his attention that felt different, more focused, more personal somehow. Atlas rose to his feet, his posture alert but not tense. He moved to the edge of the porch, head tilted, ears forward. Claire watched as his tail began to move. Not the quick, anxious wag of alarm, but the slower sweep of recognition. For several heartbeats he remained absolutely still, focused on that empty space in the yard. Then, without warning, his demeanor transformed. His tail lifted higher, wagging with enthusiasm. His body relaxed into the loose-limbed posture of happiness. Claire felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warm morning air. She had seen this before, this specific reaction from Atlas, but only in old videos Mason had sent her. It was how the shepherd greeted his handler after separations, that moment of pure joy at reunion. "Atlas?" she said softly, not wanting to break whatever spell held him captivated. But the shepherd glanced briefly in her direction, then back to the yard, as if trying to share his perception with her. When he turned to her again, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. A brightness, a certainty, a complete absence of grief. Claire didn't consider herself superstitious. She dealt in concrete realities. Her job as an accountant, the tangible responsibilities of caring for Atlas, the practical details of life after loss. But in that moment, watching the shepherd's unwavering focus and inexplicable joy, she allowed herself to wonder. Were some bonds truly unbreakable? Did some connections transcend the physical boundaries that seemed so definitive to human understanding? Atlas certainly appeared to believe so. The moment stretched, suspended in the quiet morning. Then, gradually, Atlas's posture relaxed. He turned away from whatever had captured his attention and returned to Claire's side, pressing against her leg with a contented sigh that seemed to contain both acceptance and reassurance. She rested her hand on his head, feeling the strong life pulsing beneath her fingers. "You know something I don't you?" she murmured. Atlas looked up at her, his expression somehow both ancient and immediate. In that silent exchange was a truth that needed no words, that love, once formed, never truly disappears. It merely changes form, continuing to influence and shape those it has touched. Claire smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Come on," she said, standing. "We've got veterans waiting for us." Atlas rose immediately, responsive to the shift in energy, ready for the day's mission. Together they moved into the house, leaving the porch empty save for the dancing patterns of light and shadow. But perhaps, just perhaps, they weren't quite alone after all. The bond that endures watching Atlas move among the hospital beds at the VA. Claire often found herself reflecting on the remarkable resilience of both humans and animals. The shepherd navigated the clinical environment with quiet confidence, instinctively approaching the veterans who needed him most on any given day. Some were recovering from physical injuries, others battling invisible wounds. But Atlas seemed to sense the depth of each person's need with uncanny precision. Today he had settled beside the wheelchair of a young Marine who had lost both legs to an IED 3 weeks earlier. The man had been silent and withdrawn when they entered, but as Atlas rested his head gently on his lap, something in his expression softened. "German Shepherd, right?" the Marine asked, his fingers tentatively moving to stroke Atlas's fur. "Yes," Claire replied. "He was a military working dog. Explosives detection." The Marine's eyes widened slightly. "No kidding. Where was he deployed?" "3 tours in Afghanistan. Helmand Province, mostly." A flicker of recognition crossed the man's face. "I was there too, last year." He looked down at Atlas with new respect. "He might have saved some of my buddies." Atlas maintained steady eye contact with the veteran, his presence calm and grounding. There was something almost therapeutic in the simple physical connection, the warmth of the dog against the man's legs, the rhythm of breathing, the unconditional acceptance. "Did he lose his handler?" the Marine asked quietly, somehow intuiting part of Atlas's story. Claire nodded. "My brother, Staff Sergeant Mason Reynolds. I'm sorry." The words were simple but genuine. They must have been close. "They were inseparable," Claire said, watching as Atlas continued his silent communion with the young man. "But what I've learned is that the bond doesn't end, it just changes." The Marine considered this, his hand still moving through Atlas's fur. "Yeah," he finally said. "I think that's true." As they continued their rounds through the hospital, Claire observed the subtle ways Atlas adapted his approach for each veteran, more energetic with some, gentler with others, always somehow attuned to what was needed. It was a skill no amount of training could fully explain, a kind of emotional intelligence that transcended species boundaries. Lieutenant Hayes, who occasionally joined them on these visits, had once attempted to articulate it. "Military dogs develop a sixth sense," he told her. "They live in a world of constant threat assessment, constant reading of human signals." Atlas had years of experience interpreting the slightest changes in Mason's emotional state, often before Mason himself was aware of them. That doesn't just disappear. Claire had come to believe he was right. The shepherd's sensitivity wasn't just to physical cues, but to something deeper, the emotional undercurrents that humans often tried to hide. In the VA hospital, this gift took on healing dimensions. Veterans who struggled to connect with human therapists sometimes found it easier to begin their journey back through the non-judgmental presence of a dog who had seen the same battlefields. As they prepared to leave after their final visit of the day, the head nurse stopped Claire in the hallway. "I don't know how he does it," she said, nodding toward Atlas, who waited patiently by the door. "But he always seems to know exactly who needs him most." Claire smiled. "I think that was always his specialty." The drive home was quiet, Atlas resting in the back seat, tired but content after the day's work. At a stoplight, Claire found herself studying him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were half closed, his breathing steady. To a casual observer, he might have appeared to be just a handsome, well-trained German shepherd. But Claire knew better. Atlas carried within him the legacy of his partnership with Mason, the thousands of hours of training, the life and death situations they had faced together, the unshakable trust they had built. That history informed every interaction, every decision, every moment of his current life. It was not a burden, but a foundation, one that supported the new purpose they had found together. As they pulled into the driveway, Claire's phone chimed with a message. It was Hayes, confirming their plans to attend the upcoming memorial service and adding a personal note. "Mason would be so proud of what you and Atlas are doing." You're honoring him in the best possible way." The words brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She had not set out to create a legacy or to find meaning in her brother's death. She had simply tried to provide a home for her brother's beloved partner, to ensure Atlas lived out his years with dignity and care. But somehow, along the way, something more profound had emerged. A continuation of the values Mason had lived by, of the service he had believed in so deeply. Atlas stirred in the back seat, sensing the change in her emotional state. He moved forward, resting his chin on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that had become familiar over the months. "We're okay," she assured him, reaching up to scratch under his chin, just thinking about Mason. At the sound of his former handler's name, Atlas's ears pricked forward. No matter how much time passed, he remained responsive to that particular word, as if it held special significance in his canine understanding of the world. They entered the house together, moving through the evening routine they had established. Fresh water in Atlas's bowl, a brief training session to keep his skills sharp, dinner, and finally settling in the living room where Claire usually worked or read while Atlas kept his customary watch from his bed near the window. Tonight, however, the shepherd seemed restless. He paced between the window and the door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors, his body language suggesting anticipation rather than anxiety. "What is it, boy?" Claire asked, setting aside her book. "Need to go out again?" But when she opened the back door, Atlas made no move to go into the yard. Instead, he stood in the doorway, ears alert, nose working the air currents. After a moment, he turned and looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize. Expectant, almost questioning, as if he had detected something she needed to acknowledge. Claire stepped onto the porch, scanning the darkening yard. The evening was pleasant, with a gentle breeze stirring the leaves of the maple tree Mason had planted years ago during his last home leave. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Atlas's attention remained fixed, unwavering. "I don't see anything," she told him, feeling that familiar prickle along her spine, the sensation that always accompanied these moments when Atlas perceived what she could not. The shepherd moved to the edge of the porch, his posture alert but relaxed. Then, unexpectedly, his tail began to wag, that same measured, recognizing rhythm she had observed before. He sat down, head held high, completely focused on the empty space beneath the maple tree. Claire didn't speak. She had learned to respect these episodes, to acknowledge their mystery without demanding explanation. Whether they represented Atlas's superior sensory abilities, detecting subtle environmental changes, or something more inexplicable, they were part of who he was, part of the complex, remarkable being Mason had entrusted to her care. After several minutes, Atlas stood and returned to her side, pressing against her leg in the way that always conveyed reassurance. His mission complete, whatever it had been, he was ready to return to their normal evening routine. Back inside, as Claire prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the journey they had shared. Grief had brought them together, two souls damaged by the same loss, struggling to find a way forward. But what had grown between them was far more than a mutual coping mechanism. It was a partnership with its own unique character, its own purpose and meaning. Atlas settled on his bed near the foot of hers, his breathing gradually slowing toward sleep. In the dim light, Claire could just make out the touches of gray that had spread further around his muzzle in recent months. "Good night, Atlas," she said softly. "Good night, Mason," she added, continuing the ritual she had begun in those first painful weeks after the funeral. As always, at the sound of his former handler's name, Atlas's ears twitched slightly. But tonight, something else happened. His tail moved once against the bed, a brief, contented wag before he drifted into sleep. Claire smiled in the darkness. Some might call it coincidence or projection, the human tendency to attribute meaning to animal behaviors, that aligned with our own emotional needs. But she preferred to believe it was acknowledgement, a simple confirmation of what Atlas had perhaps known all along. That love once given was never truly lost. That bonds formed in life continued beyond its boundaries. That faithfulness, the quality for which these remarkable animals were named, extended into realms beyond human understanding. With that comforting thought, Claire closed her eyes, surrendering to sleep beside the guardian who had become not just a connection to her brother's memory, but a guide to living fully in the present, honoring the past without being defined by its loss. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the maple tree, creating patterns of moonlight and shadow across the yard where earlier Atlas had kept his silent vigil. The night was peaceful, the house secure in its stillness, and if something more than moonlight and memory watched over them, well, Atlas, at least, seemed entirely unsurprised. Thank you for joining me for this story about Atlas and his journey through grief and healing. The bond between handlers and their service dogs truly exemplifies some of the most profound connections we can experience in this world. Have you ever witnessed the extraordinary loyalty of a dog, or experienced that special bond yourself? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel for more powerful narratives that celebrate the remarkable relationship between humans and their faithful companions. Your support helps these stories reach others who understand the depth and meaning of these extraordinary bonds.